welcome Dr. Neff to the stage.
Okay, thanks, Barry. Thanks, Nicole, for the invitation to present today, and thank all of you for coming to my talk. I've been at Western now 17 years, so I suppose I have seen the light. Actually, my sister is an alum, and that's how Western really got put on my map. I'm a grad from U of T. I've been here now more than any other university that I've been in the past, so this is my home. I'm going to talk about my research that I've been doing for about 3 decades now on fish and fisheries. So hopefully you like fish. You're going to see a lot of fish today. And in particularly, I've been addressing this important grand challenge, and that is, can the global fisheries continue to feed a hungry planet, or have we exhausted the ocean's bounty? And I'll cut to the chase. The answer is we can't feed everyone. The oceans have been fully tapped. We pull out 90 million tons of fish each year from the oceans, and even that is too many. By 2050, we'll need 180 million tons, so we need to double that. Okay, but it's not going to be all doom and gloom today. There are some solutions. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to feed 10 billion people by 2050 on this planet? So that's the problem. Lots and lots of people on this planet. Population continues to grow, and by 2050, we're projecting 10 billion. There's almost 8 billion people on the planet today. Add to that some challenges. I'm going to present some research that my lab's been working on fish and fisheries, but addressing, of course, climate change. So a big issue for all animals, but particularly fish. So fish are ectotherms. They don't regulate their body temperature. They're cold-blooded, so to speak. As air and water temperatures rise, so does their basal metabolic rates. So they require more energy to just survive. Okay, so climate change and warming waters are particularly challenging for fish. And so we'll talk about whether or not, in that case, it's some work I do on the Pacific salmon, so on the west coast of Canada. And will they be able to adapt to this warmer temperature? I'll also discuss very briefly invasive species. This is a lake trout. This is found in our Great Lakes. It's a native species to the Great Lakes, and attached to it is a parasitic sea lamprey that came from the Atlantic Ocean, swam in through the Erie Canal and into Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. And they decimated the lake trout fisheries for many years, but this is now a success story. We've been able to battle back the sea lampreys, bringing their numbers down. But basically, they attach to the fish and they eat the fish. Yeah, it's not so nice. But I'll talk about a grant that we have now to develop a new technology called eDNA, environmental DNA. So can we detect these invasive species before or as they enter a lake, and then mobilize our action plans? And the answer is yes. We can basically just sample some water from the lake. I could take the water that you're drinking and tell you what's in there. Maybe you don't want to know, but based on the DNA that's floating. Time permitting, I'll discuss some new research that we're doing on plastics. You've probably heard a lot about plastics, particularly in the oceans and the water. Well, guess what? There's a lot of plastics in the Thames as well. And so this is some work we're just beginning with Patricia Corcoran. She's a professor in the Department of Earth Science here. And she's done quite a bit of work looking and quantifying the plastics in the sediment of the Thames. And then now what we're trying to address is what effect are they having on the fish? And if they end up in the fish, are we eating them? I'll also, during this talk, and maybe when we return for the question period, address some of these questions. So these truths or myths. 1, you shouldn't eat seafood because it's contaminated. It's partly true. Is it better to eat wild fish than farmed fish? Sea lice from farmed fish are killing wild fish. Genetically modified fish are widespread and dangerous to eat. The Frankenfish, if any of you have heard of that. We'll talk a little bit about that today. And microplastics, are they in the food chain and are they dangerous to eat? Many of these, it's all kinda, maybe, yes and no. And so you really do have to be informed. It's not that simple where it's yes, do this, no, do that. Okay, as I mentioned, the global fisheries, so the ocean's bounty, most of the fish we eat comes out of the oceans. A small percentage comes from fresh waters, like the Great Lakes. Okay, we pull out 90 million tons per year from the oceans, and that's fully tapped. That's the ocean's bounty. Probably that's not sustainable, and we'll discuss that a bit. Probably we should be around 70 or 80 million tons. We fish just about every single species out there on this planet. We fish it, we catch it, we eat it. There's almost no species that we don't eat. This is just an example of some of the most popular fish that we catch in the fisheries, and it's a very diverse fisheries. So even the single, does anyone know what the most caught, most eaten fish, freshwater wild or ocean wild fish is? Cod? No, we ate all the cod. We did, and I'm going to show you some of that. It's a sad story, but no, we ate all the cod. We really did. There are no more cod off the East Coast. So it's the anchovy. So the anchovy, the Peruvian anchovy to be specifically, there's many species of anchovy. It's this little guy down here. But the Peruvian anchovy is the single most caught and eaten fish in the world. About 5 million tons per year of Peruvian anchovy comes out of the oceans. And yet it still only represents about 5% of the total fisheries. Okay, some other species on here that are popular. So the cods are here, but this is actually an Alaskan pollock, same genus. Some of the tunas, salmon are popular. Perch and walleye are popular, particularly out of the Great Lakes. Tilapia is now becoming increasingly farmed, and we'll talk about farming. The flatfishes like flounder and the halibut. Atlantic halibut has been a decimated stock. Pacific halibut's fished a little bit more sustainably. Mackerel's also one of the top species. Okay, but in most cases, we've basically eaten most of the fish. So we've just simply eaten too many. We've caught too many. Okay, almost every country in the world eats fish. It's one of the big four in terms of providing animal protein for sustenance, so keeping people alive. Okay, the others are beef, pork, and chicken and eggs. Chicken and eggs combined are #1 in the world, but fish is right up there surpassing pork and beef now as a major supplier of animal protein to feed people. And importantly, fish are sometimes the only reliable source of animal protein for developing countries, particularly in Asia and in the Pacific region. Okay, in Canada, well, we are about average in the world. So we eat about 20 to 30 kilograms per year of fish. And like I say, that's usually up there equal with pork, chicken, or beef. So it's one of the big four in the world. But as I mentioned, we are probably fishing too many fish out of our oceans. So this slide summarizes the fisheries from 1974 to present day, and it quantifies the different species into whether they're overexploited. This means that the stocks are in sharp decline, like the cod were. The cod are gone on our East Coast. There's still some cod that are farmed and cod on the east side of the Atlantic, but the cod off of Newfoundland are gone. So about a third of all species are overfished. 2/3 are sustainable, but as this graph would suggest, do we even really know what sustainable is? And it's tough. It's tough to know. It's really expensive to measure how many fish are out there and in the ocean. And indeed, a lot of these stocks that are believed to be sustainable are ending up in the overexploited category. And as I mentioned, there's almost no fish that we don't eat in the ocean. Only about 4 or 5% of fish aren't fished yet. What are those fish? Those are the ones that are really deep. And every year we add a new species to the roster. And so it won't be too long before, example, this lizardfish shows up at Loblaws. Yeah, this is what we're down to. So we're not fishing the lizardfish. It's found in the deep parts of the ocean. I'm in no rush to see this at Loblaws or on my plate. Okay, some sustainability ones. Well, as I said, it's always a complicated question. This is the iconic salmon, Atlantic salmon, for example. We also ate all the Atlantic salmon off our East Coast. On the West Coast, we've decimated the Pacific salmon stocks. I'll show some data later in this talk. But some salmon are sustainably fished. So if you had to choose, look for salmon from Alaska. Alaska is one of the healthiest fisheries left on this planet. And we'll talk about, though, the challenges that climate change might present to those fish. Okay, but if you want to eat salmon, I'd recommend farm salmon, particularly from Chile, and we'll see some data why later. Or if you want wild salmon, try to get it from Alaska. The BC salmon have been decimated, and we'll see some data. And as I mentioned, about 1/3 of all fishes are overexploited. They're threatened. There's moratoriums. They're collapsed. We don't fish them. The Atlantic cod, unfortunately, is one of those, the ones off of Newfoundland. Many of you will know that it used to be the pride and joy of Canada's fisheries back in the early 1900s, right through to about 1960. So we would catch about 200,000 tons of cod each year off of Newfoundland. And then largely due to the lack of appropriate government regulations and the advent of new technologies. These amazing boats that we can build now, they're massive, that can catch salmon or cod at unprecedented rates. That 200,000 per year skyrocketed to almost 1 million tons per year. The salmon collapsed 20 years later. 1992, the fisheries was closed and it's never reopened. The stocks have never recovered. There's a few inland cod fisheries that are now open, mostly for local sustenance fishing. But the fisheries has never recovered. And so it's unfortunate. Canada is now famous or infamous for this mismanagement of our cod fisheries. And so this is a book written by Michael Harris, Lament for an Ocean, The Collapse of the Atlantic Cod Fishery, a true crime story. And if that doesn't catch you, the ecological disaster of the century, the political scandal of the decade. And it really was. It was government mismanagement. The cod fisheries is now a classic case study that appears in many policy and conservation textbooks around the world as a good example of government's mismanagement of a natural resource. And so it was a real failure. Okay, so what can you do though? So you want to eat fish. I love fish. How do you know what fish to eat? There's an interesting story, Monterey Bay Aquarium, Sea-Watch. Has anyone heard of Sea-Watch? Ocean-Wise is the Canadian equivalent. They use the Sea-Watch data. So this is an aquarium basically in California, a little in Monterey, but south of San Fran. It's a beautiful aquarium. If you haven't been there, go. And basically, they by the way have become the world authority if you want to ask someone, should I eat this or should I eat that when it comes to fish? But it's basically an aquarium. It's a big aquarium, but it's an aquarium. It's not like massive. And they basically one day decided in the late 1990s that they wanted to review their own practices. So at the aquarium itself, they wanted to look at their restaurant menu and say, look at what we're serving for lunch or dinner for the people who come to visit our aquarium. Is it sustainable? Is it a good fisheries? Are those fish or seafood products contaminated? So they did an evaluation. They also evaluated the feeds that they use to feed the animals. So where are the fish coming from that they feed to other animals, like the seal in the aquarium? And are those fish sustainably sourced? And they provided this little guide here that you could pick up when you came into the aquarium. And it said, oh, eat this, eat that, don't eat this because of this. And slowly, as word, lots of people from around the world go to the Monterey Aquarium. As word got out, they started to receive requests from all over the world for their consumer guide. And they wanted it expanded, not just to the activities of the aquarium. Fast forward a little bit, they've now distributed 50 million copies of their Seafood Watch. A lot of times if you walk into Loblaws, it'll be the Monterey Aquarium that is providing the guidelines that Loblaws would give you about the sources of those food. So if you want to do something, download this app. It's free. If you have a smartphone, if you like your phone, get the Seafood Watch. It's great. Download it. You're at a restaurant, you're at Loblaws, you can punch in the species that's in front of you, and it'll tell you whether it's sustainably sourced or not, or some of the questions you should be asking. Is it from, is that coho salmon or pink salmon from Alaska, or is it from California? And if your fishmonger doesn't know, then maybe you get a different fishmonger. Okay, so what do they do? What does the Monterey do? What do these organizations do? They evaluate fisheries using 4 criteria. And so you want to be good at most of these. So the species, the fish, if it's going to be sustainable, must be abundant and resilient. So the species that are able to reproduce quickly and are resilient to fishing pressure usually are the best. The anchovy, by and large, is good. It reproduces very quickly. It has to be well managed, and this is the toughest one of most fish and fisheries. So a comprehensive management plan, the cod fisheries didn't have it in Canada, and we decimated it. And it has to be based on current scientific research. Very few fisheries have good data. It's hard to track fish in the ocean. Limited habitat damage, and we'll talk a little bit about this. So there are different ways of catching fish or farming fish, and some are better than others, and I'll explain some of those. And then limited bycatch. So you want to tap a species where when they go to fish it, that's all they catch. They don't get a whole lot of other fish that just get shoveled back into the ocean, and of course they're dead. So limited bycatch. So those are the 4 criteria that the Seafood Watch uses. As some examples, 2 bad methods of fishing. Okay, bottom trawls. They use these nets, massive steel structures, chains, and they just literally rip them across the bottom of the ocean. It destroys the bottom of the ocean and all this beautiful habitat, not just for the fish or the shrimp that they're fishing, but other species and animals that live on the bottom of the ocean. So shrimp, some of the flatfish like the halibut are fished like this, rockfish are fished like this, that's a no-no, so off the list. That said, shrimp are farmed, so farmed shrimp, in fact, there's a new company called Planet Shrimp just opened up near Tilsonburg. Has anyone heard of Planet Shrimp? So they're farmed, so that would be a better source of shrimp, or they can catch shrimp by not using bottom trawls. So that's where you start to have to ask, well, how are these shrimp sourced? Okay, so this is really bad, just destroys the bottom of the oceans. Gill nets generally are really bad. So bottom gill nets are worse, mid-water gill nets are also bad. There's bycatch, so this is a seal that got caught, died. You might have seen pictures of whales that have been ensnared in these gill nets. They're massive. They're put out by the boats and they're left, and then the boat comes around and picks them up later. They're also the single greatest source of plastic pollution in the oceans today. Single greatest source is basically lost fishing gear, gill nets being the primary source of lost fishing gear. Of course, they roll out thousands and thousands of kilometers of gill nets. Guess what? Sometimes they don't find them. Okay, what are some good ways? So purse seining is a much better way to fish. So the nets are attached to the boat. You don't lose them. And they're very localized or focused on the species that they catch. So some salmon are caught this way, some tuna are caught this way, the anchovies are caught this way. This is a good method. It's very targeted, limited bycatch, no waste. Crab fishing is also excellent. These cages, you've probably seen Deadliest Catch. It's a good, exciting TV show used to catch king crab. They do touch the bottom, but they're not ripped across the bottom. So they have limited impact on the bottom, and they're very targeted fisheries. When they put these out for king crab, they catch king crab. They don't catch really anything else. So there's limited bycatch. So this is also a good method of fishing. So what are your choices? Well, if you went to the seafood guide, king crab generally are very good. Lionfish, trout, farmed trout. There's a lot of rainbow trout farmed in the Great Lakes. It's an excellent source of fish. Tilapia now is one of the fastest growing farmed fish. The most farmed fish is actually carp. Yeah, it's not that popular in North America. It's very, very popular in Asia though. Okay, and then tuna, but tuna you gotta ask questions. So bluefin tuna obviously are endangered, no. Skipjack though, a smaller species that reproduces. The fisheries is generally quite targeted, a much better choice. On the no side, cod. Cod's out, sorry if you love cod, but we ate them all. So we really can't eat them. Farm cod's better, but wild cod, almost all the stocks, particularly those in Canada, have been decimated. Same with the Atlantic halibut, orange roughy, sharks, no-no, swordfish, no-no. Again, they've been decimated in terms of numbers, but they also tend to be fairly toxic because they eat very high in the food chain. So you might be introducing yourself to mercury contamination or PCBs. Okay, what about local? I do want to encourage you to eat fish though, so do remember there are good choices. So not all fish are bad. And this is just Ontario, the Great Lakes. I spent a lot of time floating on these lakes in the summer. They can be really rough, but they're also very beautiful. They're an amazing source of fish, fantastic fisheries on our Great Lakes. Okay, and these are all species you can find in the Great Lakes or are farmed on the Great Lakes that if you see them in the store, buy local. This is a good choices of fish. So rainbow smelt, it's a small little species. You kind of have to like smelt. Yellow perch and walleye, pickerel are great species. You can often get those in Loblaws if you look for them. A lot of them are coming out of Lake Erie. Okay, whitefish, another good choice. Tilapia are now farmed in closed farm systems in Ontario and our surrounding area, so another excellent choice. I don't find them that tasty, but they're not a fishy fish, so you can do lots with them. Okay, shrimp, I mentioned Planet Shrimp. So they opened up maybe 5 years ago, and I think are now into production phase. They were just setting up their plant in one of the old tobacco, the big tobacco drying garages or rooms, massive, the size of football fields. So they have a really cool closed containment system. So an excellent source if you want shrimp is try to source them from Planet Shrimp, okay, as opposed to those bottom trawls. Okay, lake trout I mentioned. Lake trout's beautiful, a beautiful fish to eat. They were decimated by the sea lampreys, but it's now a success story in terms of invasive species because we've been able to hammer back the sea lamprey. And then as I also mentioned, rainbow trout. They're a Pacific salmon. They're not a trout at all, but they're now farmed actively in the Great Lakes, and so another choice that you might want to look for. Okay, as I alluded to, there is though a growing food gap, And so what I've plotted here first is the fisheries. So this is what we have taken from the oceans, and basically about 1980 or so, it plateaued at that 90 million tons. So there's no more fish we can be taking. Probably that 90 million is a few too many. It needs to be lower than that. And that's on the left side here in millions of tons. On the right, I have the global population in billions. That's this yellow line. And basically, as the population grew in our world and on this planet, the fisheries grew as well to feed those people. But as of about 1990, there's been a continuing growing food gap, this distance between the population and the amount of animal protein that we can source from the oceans. Okay, and it's projected by 2050, when there will be 10 billion people on this planet, to be about 50% short. So whereas we're pulling out 90 million, we need 180 million tons. So where is that going to come from? Any guesses? Where are we going to get that? Farms. Yeah. Yeah, farms. We industrialize it. We can't hunt fish anymore, at least not more than we are. They're the last, species, taxon of animals that we hunt. We don't hunt anything else like we hunt fish. Okay, we've domesticated them and we farm them. Okay, so that's how we feed. The cow. Okay, we don't hunt cows anymore. They're farmed. We don't hunt pigs, they're farmed. We don't hunt chickens, they're farmed. Okay? Fish are the last species out there that we still actively hunt and at high levels to feed people. Okay? And so the natural progression is we have to domesticate fish and farm them. And indeed, we've been doing this for a long time, many decades. But it really has taken off only in the last, say, 15 to 20 years. And indeed, aquaculture, as it's called, now produces as much fish as it comes out of the oceans. So we're up to about 80 million tons per year come out of farms. Even though that, it's only about 20 years old, the industry. I mean, some people have been farming for a long time, but in terms of it actually being industrialized. And so now if you go buy a fish, just by, all else being equal, there's a greater than 50% chance that it came from a farm. Okay, so we eat more farmed fish than we do wild fish. And that's not a bad thing. It's also the fastest growing food industry in the world. It's averaged about 7% annual growth for about 15 years now. This is a fish farm that I've worked with. This is a partner of mine out in British Columbia on Quadra Island, or just off of Quadra Island. It's called Yellow Island Aquaculture. They're an organic Chinook farm. And I'll talk a little bit later today about some of the research we've done there and in BC on Chinook salmon. Okay, and so this is a Time magazine that came out a few years ago, and it said, "The future of fish, can farming save the last wild food?" And the answer, I believe, is yes. But there is a problem, and we'll see that in a moment. So here I've just plotted on the growth of farming. So we've been farming for many years, but really it was around 1990 when that food gap started to grow that farming really took off. And now farming is projected to be able to produce enough fish to meet in fact, exceed global population growth. So farming can feed the world. Okay, but as I mentioned, there are problems. It was one of the myths or truths I had at the beginning. So farmed fish, some farmed fish have some contaminants. They're not so high that you shouldn't eat them, but if you go to a really strict guideline like the Environmental Protection Agency, they might suggest as few as 2 meals per month. So it's not that much. Okay, it's because they are contaminated. And so this is some data that came out in 2004. I'll add, though, that this study's never been repeated. So 15 years later, and we still haven't done this again, which is a little odd. You may know that there's a lot of an active movement, including from the Suzuki Foundation, against fish farming. And I'd like to dispel that myth. It's like any other kind of farming. We have to do it if we want to feed our planet. Okay, we cannot hunt wild fish anymore. We've basically eaten them all. So we have to look to farming to help meet global demand for fish products. Okay, but that said, we got to get it right. And so we got some work to do here, and I've been working on this issue. So here we have the salmon flesh. This is from some various salmon farms around the world. And basically, we're measuring the quantity of PCBs. PCBs are not good things to eat. Okay, and so these are all farmed. The blue bars are farmed, and the green bars are wild, some wild fish from out in the West Coast, so Alaska and British Columbia. Okay, generally the PCBs in wild fish are lower than the farm. So we do have an issue here. We've got to get the PCB levels lower. That said, I'll just hasten to add that if you're looking for healthier farms, go to Chile. They're just slightly more contaminated than, say, if you're grabbing a wild Chinook salmon from British Columbia. So to put it in perspective, wild fish aren't 100% clean either. Okay, but there's more PCBs in farm fish based on these data, and it's true. And so the question is why? Like, where are these PCBs coming from? Well, the point is we fed it to them. It's in the feed that we give these fish. So salmon are fed. They're little pellets of food. They don't graze in these net pens. We actively feed them. It's the single biggest source of cost to a fish farm is the actual feed. Okay, so what this other study looked at was, well, where are those PCBs coming that are in the farm fish? And they just looked at the feed that was being given to the fish. Notice the axes jump here. So the PCB concentrations in that feed were even higher. Well, of course, you feed a fish PCBs, it's going to end up in its flesh. So it's a relatively easy problem. So by the way, these PCBs are coming, fish food has fish meal in it. So what that means is that we catch other fish, anchovies, for example, we grind them up into meal and we put it into the little fish food that we feed other fish. So it's a way of feeding a fish. And importantly, it's the source of those omega fatty acids. So we also feed this contaminated feed to our chickens. So if you're getting those nice omega fatty acids, you do want to be careful that they're not also introducing PCBs when they feed those chickens fish meal. Okay, but it's coming from the wild anchovies, and that's a coastal fisheries. If they happen to be off a country that dumps lots of nasty chemicals into the oceans, then they often end up in the fish. So it's not really a hard problem. We want to clean up farming. We just got to clean up the feed. Stop feeding them the PCBs. Pretty easy. And we've been working on that, and I'll tell you, we haven't got a solution yet. But we ultimately, our goal is ultimately to turn a salmon into a vegetarian. So they're a piscivore, so they eat other fish, and so they're higher in the food chain, and that has problems. One is that the anchovies themselves may be being overfished because we want so many of them not just to feed us, but to feed other fish. So it reduces the impact of salmon farming if we can get them to eat lower on the food chain. So we literally are trying to turn them into herbivores, and that's much, much tougher. But in the shorter term, as I mentioned, most fish food for salmon includes high fish meal. It's where we get some of the carotenoids, that nice color, that they'll use that to produce that nice, red or orange coloration, as well as those omega fatty acids, which are so important because of the health benefits, the omega-3 and 6 fatty acids. So what we did, this was some work done by a graduate student, Kat Dowdy, shown here on the right, done out at Yellow Island Aquaculture in British Columbia with Chinook salmon. We said, well, and we work with Taploid Feed, so it's a feed company out in British Columbia. They actually source the dog food for Purina puppy chow. So same company, you can go to them. They're amazing in terms of knowing nutrition, and they designed some diets for us. So they first produced the standard fish food that we would give to salmon, and then they produced a new one that had almost no fish meal in it, but instead we substituted that fish meal with chicken meal. So we took the anchovy here, and instead of using anchovies, we made our fish food using chicken. Okay, about the same price. The advantage of using chicken is that it's a highly regulated industry, so it's really clean. So whereas this comes from the ocean, and we just don't know, it depends where those anchovies came from, they may or may not have contaminants. The chicken, we know, is not contaminated. Then the question was, would the fish eat it? Would they be like, hey, this is chicken, I don't like it? And the answer is they ate it, which is great. The other big question was, were we still getting those omega fatty acids? So did the salmon that we produced still have those high omega-3 and 6 fatty acids, which lots of people buy salmon for. They want those health benefits. So if we look on the right, first thing is they ate it and they grew just as fast. So this is our chicken diet here. This is our standard or controlled diet with the fish meal. So no different. So they grew just as fast. So that's great. So a hatchery or a farm might actually adopt this feed. They also had those same omega fatty acids. So no difference. In fact, it's slightly elevated, but not statistically different. So no problem there. We are off to the races. Except when we filleted a few of them, our chicken one looked like chicken breasts. So there's our control diet. When you buy salmon, this is a Chinook salmon, you probably are looking for this. If you had that, you might have a few customers saying, no, that's not salmon. So, but it actually is. And so, this doesn't have market value. If you do a survey of consumers, they're not going to buy a Chinook salmon. Even if you say, hey, we're more sustainably sourcing this using chicken, it looks like chicken. So, and by the way, we haven't eaten this, so anyone who's going to ask me what it tastes like, I don't know. So, but this isn't a hard problem. This is the research we're still working on. We got to get this now with the chicken meal to look like that. And as I mentioned, we know where that color comes from. It comes from carotenoids. Carotenoids are not a bad thing. Some people say it's food coloring and dye. No, it's not. It's a natural substance. We produce it from natural methods. So it comes from algae, bacteria, and other sources. So astaxanthin is the carotenoid. It's the same thing that gives your carrots a nice color. It's the same thing that makes your cardinals red. So when you see them in the winter, the males in particular are very red. That's carotenoids as well. Okay, it's a very natural substance, nothing to be afraid of. People call it food coloring. As long as it's a carotenoid, it's not food coloring in a bad way. Okay, so astaxanthin, it's a precursor to vitamin A, which primes the immune system, helps with brain development. Lots of benefits to carotenoids. We just need to find out what happened to them. We put carotenoids in the food, so something else happened. Where did they go? They didn't get deposited into the flesh, and so that's where we're at. Maybe we just need to add more vitamin A to the food that we're feeding them, and we might restore the color. Okay, so not a hard problem, though, to address this issue of the feed being contaminated and hence the farm fish being contaminated. We can solve this. I'm just one lab in the world, and in a couple of years, with the help of a graduate student, we've made some really good progress. Okay, I alluded to Frankenfish and GMOs. And so are they out there? The answer is yes. It's the first genetically modified animal ever that you could buy and eat. So plants we've been modifying forever. Most people don't even know that most of the plants you eat are genetically modified in some capacity. But the Frankenfish is. And I think it's a success story, albeit there's a lot of misinformation around it. So this is a cute little cartoon. It's a live master, but is it safe for people to eat? This is our genetically modified salmon. It's an Atlantic salmon that's been modified. And then here's a scientist over here saying, put it on the market and we'll find out in 5 or 10 years. Okay, so the short answer is it's absolutely safe to eat. In fact, there's been no species, no plant or animal, it's the first animal ever to hit the markets that have been more scrutinized. For almost 25 years, they've been doing tests on this. It was treated as a drug, which has a much, much stricter safety criteria, so the FDA in the US, than food does. So it was treated as a drug and eventually was approved by the FDA a few years ago. It's now marketed in Canada, but not in the US yet, even though it was first approved. This is building on technology that was developed by a scientist at the University of Memorial in Newfoundland, and then developed by a country that originated in Prince Edward Island. So this one day will be a great Canadian success story, I believe. Okay, but why is everyone so worried? What is Frankenfish? What do they do? Well, they start with Atlantic salmon. So of salmon, this is the farm salmon. So almost no other salmon is farmed. I work with Chinook salmon on the West Coast, but very, very small farm. Atlantic salmon are farmed around the world now, including in Chile. You mentioned Chile in your opening. So there are no salmon in the southern hemisphere, but there are now because they're farmed and they escaped. That's another story I'm not going to talk about. But Atlantic salmon, we know a lot about farming Atlantic salmon. Okay, shown here in the bottom. What did they do to make Frankenfish? Well, all they did is introduced changed one gene in this fish. They took a promoter region from another fish. So the pout here, it's kind of like an eel, but took a promoter. It's just a slippy promoter. Promoter is a thing that turns on or off a gene. So they took this thing because the pout, the particular promoter, is often on. So we're just going to take a gene and make sure it's turned on. They then took the growth hormone gene from a Chinook salmon. Chinook are the biggest salmon in the world. There's a reason why they're the biggest. They grow quickly, they produce lots of growth hormone, okay? But not too much that is harmful for you. Lots of people eat Chinook, I eat Chinook, there's no problem. Okay, but they took this thing's growth hormone gene with that promoter and stuck it in the Atlantic salmon. And then, this took decades to do. It's really amazing technology. And then eventually when they got it to kind of go into the genome, this is what you ended up with. So it's Aqua Bounty's the company. There's your Frankenfish. It's an Atlantic salmon, same species except for that one gene, the growth hormone and the promoter from the Chinook. So it's basically got a little bit of another fish in it. You may have heard of hybridization. Different salmon can breed and produce a hybrid. It's not really that different. And so it basically produces growth hormone all the time. It doesn't stop, you know, at certain months of the year. And so the fish eats and eats and eats and grows and grows and grows. That's a wild type, so they're exactly the same age. So that's what the Atlantic salmon would look like without this GMO. That's what it looks like with the GMO. And so basically it grows about twice as fast. So it's market ready twice as soon. So in say a year instead of 2 years. Okay, one of the problems, so I think it's completely safe. They did so many tests on it, just basically looking at how much growth hormone is actually in there, and should you be concerned by eating that elevated growth hormone. There's nothing else different about it. There's nothing weird about it other than that it has more growth hormone. It has no more growth hormone than the Chinook salmon has. That's where it came from. The Chinook salmon that are wild and lots of people eat. Okay, but there's definitely a labeling issue here. There is, you know, around information and misinformation. And indeed, as I mentioned, you can get this in Canada now, and there is a conversation to have there, because as far as I know, you wouldn't know. So there's no requirement by the people producing and selling it to label it as a GMO. And so some people, you know, maybe rightfully so, have some concern there. They'd like to know and then make their own choice. Okay, so it is available, it is on market, but I have no idea where, because it's not labeled as such. So in Canada, but not the US, first GMO animal ever to hit market for human consumption. Okay, let's talk a little bit about climate change and what impact is it going to have, particularly on fish. You probably know the story. We basically love oil, and we release lots of CO2 as a result. Okay, more CO2 goes up into the atmosphere than the biosphere, the ecosystem can pull out. And so CO2 levels have been steadily rising, particularly since the industrialization of the world. And this has led, it basically acts like a blanket, has led to rising global air temperatures. And indeed, over the last about 50 years, mean surface air temperatures have risen by about 1 degree Celsius. Not too bad. Projections, however, for the end of the end of the millennium are for a mean air temperature increase of about 4 degrees, but importantly, much higher, up around 6, 7, 8 degrees in the north. And this is where some of our healthiest fisheries are. I already mentioned Alaska, right, as being the last stronghold for salmon. So a question we want to know is what's going to happen if that air temperature, the rivers that these the little babies live in and that the adults spawn in, increases. And already we're seeing about a ½ degree increase in river temperatures, by the way, on our west coast. So are the fish going to be okay? Well, as I mentioned, the Pacific salmon are an iconic species for Canada and the US. These are the 5 you're probably most familiar with. Chinook, that's the one that, you know, we took the growth hormone gene from and put it in the Atlantic salmon on the other side of the ocean. So Chinook, the species I work with. Sockeye is very popular in the restaurants. Pink is probably the single healthiest fisheries left. So buy pink from Alaska if you're going to pick a salmon. Coho and chum. Okay, those are the big 5. As I mentioned, though, not all fisheries have been well managed. So Alaska is the last stronghold. This is historic run size, so an estimate in millions of fish of, so basically population size, and then the current run size. So in Alaska, still basically the same. Okay, they're heavily managed, but that's okay. They're still really healthy. When we go to British Columbia, not so. Okay, only 27% of the salmon are left out in the wild. And so while Suzuki might promote eating wild fish, we're basically eating them to extinction. So I disagree with him. Okay, look at Washington Coast, Puget Sound 8%, Washington 3%, Columbia Basin 2%, Oregon 7%, California 5%. We ate 95% of them, and Suzuki's still saying eat more. Okay, no. All right, he's wrong on that. Okay, if you're going to eat wild salmon, eat them from Alaska if you can. Okay, but now there's this issue about what's going to happen. So Alaska's this stronghold. Alaska's going to increase by 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. The fish are ectotherms. That means their basal metabolic rate is going to increase. They're going to need more energy, and they're going to have to handle this heat stress. Can they do it? There's been a lot of sensational news this past summer. You might have seen some of it, of these massive die-offs of salmon in Alaska. Got a little news clip. Let's see if it works. In case you didn't hear this sensational news.
Unprecedented heat waves are to blame for reduced salmon populations in parts of Alaska. Researchers found more than 800 dead salmon at the end of July during a river expedition. They believe the total is 4 to 10 times higher than that. An inspection of the fish revealed they did not have parasites or an infection. They were carrying healthy eggs. The die-off coincides with a heat wave and record high water temperatures. CNN reports stream temperatures near Anchorage surpassed 76 degrees this year for the first time since record keeping started in 2002. Katie Johnston, CBS Local News.
Okay, so is there cause for concern? We're going to address that with some of the research we've looked at. Some things to remember there. First of all, she said, I think 800 fish. Maybe there were 4 or 5 times as many of those. Whatever, there were thousands and thousands of fish died. But these run sizes are usually in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of fish. So not that many. But the other number is that for the first time ever in Alaska, those river temperatures hit, I think she said 76 degrees Fahrenheit, so about 24 degrees Celsius. Okay, just try to remember that number, because we're going to come back to, is 24 degrees Celsius warm for a salmon in a river? Okay, so there are 2 ways that a fish can respond to increased temperatures. And I don't care which they do, but they can adapt. I'm putting that in quotes for the evolutionary biologists out there. They can adapt by developmentally. It's what we call phenotypic plasticity. So basically their physiology just changes when they're exposed to that warmer temperature to handle or perform in that warmer temperature. It's no different than when we go up into the mountains. You know, we're going to go skiing this Christmas. If you're at elevation, when you first arrive, you tend to be a little lightheaded and you tire very quickly. Your body responds by producing more red blood cells, more hemoglobin, that can chelate oxygen, get it to your tissues, and after a few days, you're fine. That's plasticity. Okay, you simply go into where there's less oxygen, your body adapts through physiology. So the fish can do that too, maybe. They can also respond evolutionarily, so they can evolve. And what that means is their genes could change, or maybe we're going to have to change them, so that they have a different mechanism to respond. And in order for a species to evolve, or a population to evolve, it has to have what's called additive genetic variance. Okay, so basically there has to be some individuals in the population, for whatever reason, have a gene that allowed them to perform well at a warmer temperature. Then we go get that individual and make a whole lot of babies with it, which is literally what we would do. Okay, importantly, without going into too much of the detail, one important way to look at whether or not a fish can adapt to a warmer temperature is to look at its circulatory system, and particularly its heart. This comes from a whole body of research that's called the oxygen carrying capacity limited thermal tolerance hypothesis. So it's a real mouthful. But all this work suggests that what happens when a fish is exposed to high temperatures, what ultimately kills it is the lack of capacity of that heart to deliver oxygenated blood to tissues. So they have a heart attack. Okay, and so we're going to use that method to try to assess whether or not Chinook salmon, for example, in Alaska, can handle 24 degrees Celsius, or they're going to have a heart attack. Okay, it's basically when you have a collapse of aerobic performance. There isn't enough oxygen to do anything like exercise, let alone even provide enough to the heart itself to keep it pumping. Okay, I'm not going to go into too many details around this, but it's what's called a quantitative genetic breeding design. It's a way we can breed these animals to look at both the plasticity as well as whether or not there's additive genetic variance. So do they have capacity to evolve? This was some work done by a graduate student of mine, Nico Menez, in the upper right. And as I mentioned, this is with Chinook salmon that was done out in British Columbia on Vancouver Island. So he uses this quantitative genetic breeding design because they produce eggs and we can get sperm from males. It's all done externally. We can breed multiple females with multiple males, and that's what we do, and that's key. We then take each one of those full sib families, so maybe it's that female with that male, we put it over here. We can then take those eggs and we expose them to current river water temperatures, so our control, our +0, so to speak. Then we simply heated that water for the other half of the family, the other half of the eggs, +4 in this. So this is the projected global warming for the end of the century. So these ones, from the moment they were conceived, were simply exposed to warmer temperatures. So by comparing these brothers and sisters across the 2 temperatures, we get at phenotypic plasticity. If we just simply rear them at +4, do they do better? By then comparing males, so males mated with multiple females, because males only provide the sperm to the offspring, only their DNA. If one male just happens, all his offspring just happen to always outperform another male at warmer temperatures, then we can use that to calculate the additive genetic variance. Okay, so what did Nico do? Well, as I mentioned, we were measuring the heart. So what do? It's no different than many of you if you've had a stress test done on yourself. Doctor, hooks you up to an EKG, puts you on a treadmill, and you run, and you run, and you run. Okay, and he monitors your heart, or she monitors your heart. We do the same thing with a fish. So this is a little Chinook salmon. This is our treadmill. He's hooked up to an EKG, so a couple electrodes, and literally we get a heartbeat. This is this guy's heart beating at 10 degrees Celsius, so he's in water. Then we make him do exercise. So we can do that at rest, and then we can make him do it at exercise. And we always want to maximize aerobic scope, and something that I'm going to call T-opt. So that's the optimum temperature. That's when aerobic scope is maximized. So the basal demands, or the peak demand, so when you're exercising, your heart's pumping as fast as it can, minus what your basal, your resting is. You want that there to be lots of aerobic scope. Okay, that's a good thing. You got lots to go swimming, find some prey, to eat, run away from predators, or just grow. Okay, so T-opt is the optimal temperature. Okay, so we put him in there. We can do it at rest, and then we don't make him swim. We actually use a drug, atropine, to simulate exercise. So the atropine makes his heart beat as fast as it can. So it's as if we're making him run as fast as he or she can on this treadmill. Up to the EKG, we warm the water slowly. So 10 degrees up to 23, the heart starts beating faster and faster and faster, and then it eventually goes arrhythmic. So it's no longer this nice even beat pattern. It's when the heart goes arrhythmic that the fish is having a heart attack. If that temperature isn't brought down immediately, that fish will die. Okay, so that sets an upper critical maximum. So we simply plot this data and use certain statistical techniques to determine the optimum. It's basically the inflection point, but this is the best temperature. So for that fish, it was 14. So it's going to perform really well if the river was 14. When it hits the arrhythmia temperature for this fish, it was 24 degrees Celsius. That was that temperature that the Alaska rivers hit for the first time ever. Okay, it's having a heart attack. So probably those fish that were on the shore had a heart attack. Okay, well, what's the story here? Well, we then use that quantitative genetic breeding design and some statistical techniques to look for the plasticity. It shows up as a rearing effect. So, and these are our data. These are our paternal sibling families plotted here. This is the optimal temperature in degrees Celsius on the y-axis. So if we simply increase the temperature that we rear them at, we found that all of them did better. That's a good news story. So their T-opt goes up. Put them in a 4-degree warmer water, their optimal temperature. So the heart works better at that warmer temperature. But it's not a one-to-one tracking. So a 4-degree increase in the temperature led to a 2-degree increase in the optimum. But still, good news. There is also a sire effect. So that's that additive genetic variance is statistically significant. Shows up here basically because these lines are somewhat parallel. So males that produce kids that did well at higher temperatures tend to always do better than the kids from some other male. So that means there's also a capacity for these populations to evolve to that warmer temperature for T-opt. So again, a good news story. Not so good, TR, that upper critical when they're going to have a heart attack, no evidence that rearing them at a warmer temperature changes it. They still croak at the same temperature. No additive genetic variance, so no chance that they're going to evolve either. The genes just aren't in the population to handle river temperatures above 24 degrees Celsius. Okay, we use those data then to say what's going to happen. So here we have our two different rearing temperatures. Our T-ops are plotted on, and then the TRs, which basically have no effect. This is the current river temperatures that Chinook salmon experience in British Columbia. Okay, no problem, look. The T-ops is well within that range, probably evolved as an adaptation. So they perform very well in river temperatures from about 12 degrees up to 20. TR, well outside of that. The rivers just never get that hot, so they don't have to worry. What are the projections, though, for 2100? They're getting warmer, warmer. It's getting hot in here. Okay, T-ops still within that, so you're going to be rearing them at that warmer temperature, well within the range. Good, so they're going to be pretty happy. But on those really hot days, so that, if we looked at them on any given day, yeah, they're doing really well. But on those really hot days where it hits 24 degrees Celsius, boom, suddenly your population's all having heart attacks. Okay, and we modeled that based on two different IPCC projections. And if the average projections met, and this was catastrophic loss, so where we would lose half of the individuals in the population, just boom like that. Okay, average projection, 20% chance of that. That's not too bad. The maximum projection, though, so if we're up closer to 6 or 7 degrees warmer, then there's nearly 100% chance that the Chinook salmon in British Columbia are gone, okay, by 2100. So that's something to worry about. We got 80 years, so we can figure this out. But we got to start figuring this out. We got to certainly combat global warming, but we also are probably going to have to be more explicit about what we do with salmon. So what can we do? We're going to have to move them. That's one option. It's not the most appealing because people want salmon in California and British Columbia, but maybe too warm for them. So they're gonna have to go up to Alaska or farther north than that. Or who knows, we have to start getting clever, you know? Do we start genetically modifying them? Do we put a gene that allows, in that fish that allows its heart to pump at 24 degrees Celsius? There are other fish out there that do, there's fish that live in the tropics. So we know it exists. Okay, those are the conversations we need to start having. We got 80 years to figure it out. Okay, so I'm gonna quickly go through the invasive species and the plastics just really quickly. So invasive species, you know, and some new technologies. There's lots in the Great Lakes, so a huge issue. Zebra mussels you've known about, those that like to scuba dive, they're wonderful and they've increased clarity. They also, they'll cut your hands and sometimes foul up some of the nice shipwrecks. So not so good for the ecosystem. Quagga mussels are also in the Great Lakes. Asian carp, have you heard of Asian carp? Yeah, are they in the Great Lakes? Yeah, no, not yet, almost though. So there are two species, by the way, the bighead carp and the silver carp. There is common carp in the Great Lakes, been there forever. Common carp are not quite as big, but basically same issue. Okay, these are on the doorsteps of the Great Lakes though, coming in through the Chicago Sanitary and Shipping Canal. Okay, and lots of work. There's that ugly, ugly sea lamprey. Yeah, they just eat the fish, they're disgusting. So attached to the walleye, you know, great fisheries in Erie, this is what they do to our lake trout. Decimate, 80% of wounds are fatal, so decimated the lake trout fisheries. You know, good news story, if we just jump to the good news story, is that we started using lampricide and other techniques to hammer back the sea lamprey. And this was the lake trout population, it got decimated, but they've rebounded wonderfully. So, but we spend, I think, I don't know, $100 million a year trying to control sea lamprey. Okay, just the new technology, eDNA, it's really cool. It actually works. You need to perfect this, but you just go out and sample some water, you know, from the lake, anywhere, the Thames. You can actually extract DNA. It's DNA that came from stuff sloughed off, slime, scales, urine, from these fish that might be in the lake. And then we use barcoding, so we can amplify a mitochondrial gene and actually determine present absence of species. And so when we look at the Great Lakes, zebra mussels, quagga mussels, yes. Sea lamprey, yes. That's our lake trout, so our native species, but no strong evidence yet of the Asian carp in the Great Lakes. It'll first show up though in Lake Michigan, so we keep sampling our water and we'll see, and they're right at the doorstep. So they're probably gonna end up in the lake. Okay, plastic waste, basically at a time there's a lot of plastic. It's really gross. Fishing nets, remember, the single biggest. This is Patricia Corcoran, so a professor in earth science. She's been sampling sediment from the Thames. She's in the Thames here, analyzing that for plastics. Lo and behold, there's a lot of plastic in our Thames, okay, particularly just south of London, river flowing this way into Lake St. Clair. The size of these bubbles is the amount of plastic, so exceeding 1,500 pieces of these fibers in plastic in per kilogram of sediment. So lots of plastics, we really have no idea what the impact is, and that's what we're working with her here. So this is another graduate student of mine, Colleen Wardlaw, and the big questions are they getting into the fish, so fouling the gills? We know that they are ingesting them, so they end up in the stomachs. Does that hurt the fish in any way? We just don't know. So we're trying to address that. And perhaps more importantly, do they end up in the flesh and are we eating them? And then should we be concerned that we're eating plastic that we're putting into the Thames or any other rivers? So what can you do? Well, on the plastic side, it's easy. Man, single-use plastics has to go. Like, why are we still talking about plastic straws and plastic bags? It's so simple. Like, there is like 40, I think, million tons of plastic in the oceans alone. You know, let's get rid of the plastic bags. It's not hard. You know, the wax straw, I grew up on wax straws. Probably you did too. And they weren't that bad. Okay, so reusable, and we can clean it up. We got to get out there and clean up this stuff. Invasive species, you know, they move because we move them. Zebra mussels are in the Great Lakes because they came in the ballast of ships. They get transported around by boaters. So we can be pretty active in just trying to minimize the amount of movement. You know, they come through our canals when we build them. Okay, so again, it's us. We can do something about it. It's not rocket science. These answers are not that hard. It really just is a social issue about will we do it? Yes or no? Okay, the global warming is a really big issue. You know, we got to get off the fossil fuels, and that's not as easy, okay? But we can work towards it. We're trying to green. We can certainly live greener, ride your bike a little more, but also we need to turn to alternative fuel sources, especially in Canada where we need energy. I mean, it's cold up here. Okay, on the seafood, download the app. Just download this app. It's free. It took like about 2 seconds on my phone. And anytime you're thinking of a fish or seafood, type it in there, and it gives you all kinds of wonderful information and questions to ask. You'll look really smart if you start saying, was this shrimp bottom trawled or farmed? Oceanwise is the Canadian equivalent, so also an excellent organization that works closely with Seafood Watch. Okay, so conclusions. Sustainable fisheries and aquaculture have a vital role to feeding our hungry planet, and we can do this. We can clean up aquaculture, and it will meet global demand. We can feed 10 billion people on this planet. It's a whole other question about is 10 billion too many. That's beyond my talk, all right? But we can feed them, and it's going to be aquaculture that does it. Climate change is a big challenge. 24 degrees is going to kill the salmon in British Columbia. So we got to start talking about that. It's nice, it's warm, but it's not good for the fish. Aquatic invasive species are a risk to native ecosystems, okay? And they're costly to manage, so we got to minimize the spread of invasive species. Plastic and microplastics are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. We got to get rid of the single-use plastics, but we don't know the consequences. We just don't know, and so we do need more research. Okay, I'll take some questions, I guess, after the break. Thank you.